to share with you the major messages coming out of Working Group 3 on governance of CDR. Let me share my screen. The major message is that unless there are immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, 1.5 degrees Celsius is beyond reach. And accelerated climate action is critical to sustainable development. The evidence is clear, the time for action is now, and there are options available now in every sector that can at least halve emission by 2030. Early strengthening of mitigation actions in this decade reduces substantially CDR requirement until 2100. This was also a major conclusion from Spatial Report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is P1 pathway, which shows how low demand scenarios reduces the CDR requirement compared to high emission scenarios. The faster we reduce emission in the next decade or so, the less we will need to rely on CDR to achieve and sustain net zero, or to reverse warming that we have already caused. Any further delay in climate policy substantially increases carbon lock-in and mitigation challenges. It creates dependence on carbon dioxide removal technologies for meeting the Paris climate goals. For the first time, IPCC report has discussed CDR methods substantially in chapter 12 and has also devoted one full chapter on demand side mitigation actions. Chapter 5 of IPCC Working Group 3 report shows in the demand side at a global scale, there is untapped mitigation potential to bring down global emission by between 40 to 70% by 2050, starting immediately by scaling up policies, providing access to infrastructure and end-use technologies that are already tested, tried, and have proven effective. Table 5.2 in chapter summarizes long-term scenarios that aim to minimize service level energy and resource demand from assessment of this emerging body of literature, that low demand scenarios can reduce both supply side capacity addition and the need for carbon capture and removal technologies to reach emission targets. Historically, most long-term mitigation scenarios have taken technology-centric approaches with heavy reliance on supply-side solutions. And the use of carbon dioxide removal, particularly in 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios. Comparatively less attention has been paid to deep mitigation side reductions, both in long-term integrated assessment models and energy system demand models. The three high confidence statements need to be read together from this Working Group 3 report, which sends out a clear message. Large-scale deployment of CDR may not prove as effective as expected, as depending on the type of CDR used and likely to negatively impact food availability, biodiversity, employment, water stress, energy affordability and access, and mineral resource extraction, suggesting it may not be a viable carbon removal strategy in the next 10 to 20 years. Also, large-scale deployment implies heavy reliance on CDR methods, most of which have not been implemented at scale yet, which is also presented in table 12.6 of the full report about the technology readiness of the different CDR methods. However, lower energy demand achieved through behavioral change or the infrastructure use or provision of different end-use energy technology can reduce emissions, and the requirement for CDR will be much less, as the unabated emission in the supply side through demand reduction is much lower than the total emission which is envisaged for or projected for 2050. In Working Group 3 report, the illustrative mitigation pathways include a set of transformative pathways that illustrates how choices may lead to distinctly different transformations that may keep temperature increase to below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Also, what is important is that a stronger emphasis on demand-side mitigation implies less dependence on CDR and consequently reduced pressure on land and biodiversity. Model results show in low demand scenario, the different mitigation strategies could lead to phasing out of fossil fuel dependence and requirement for CDR in energy systems through this century. Now, many challenges such as dependence on CDR, pressure on land and biodiversity, and reliance on technologies with high upfront investment are significantly reduced in model pathways that assume using resource more efficiently, as we said, in the low demand scenarios or the scenarios where there is shift to global development towards sustainability. While direct air capture and bioenergy and CCS feature in varying degrees in all pathways, but not in low demand scenarios. However, achieving zero CO2 emission at present is technically impossible, but net zero targets have been set by many countries, which acknowledges that CDR is required to counterbalance those emissions that cannot be eliminated completely. So here it shows the sectoral GH emissions at the time of net zero CO2 emissions compared to model 2019 emissions in all different illustrated mitigation pathways. So there are some emissions which still remain, which are mostly in non-CO2 from all sectors. And so what it implies is that in this context, it is highly relevant whether a country aims for net zero CO2 or net zero GHG emissions, since the bulk of emission that cannot be eliminated and thus have to be counterbalanced by CDR, and which is non-CO2, including that from agriculture. So in order to realize the mitigation potential of net zero emission targets, scrutiny of use and risks of carbon dioxide removal and attention to equity, near-term action coupled with long-term intent setting and ongoing monitoring and review are of primary importance. So Working Group 3 report provides a detailed assessment of what we know and what we do not know of CDR. Some measures such as afforestation, reforestation, peatland and coastal restoration and improved forest management can enhance employment and local livelihoods when governed appropriately. Even if we are able to scale up proven CDR methods like afforestation and reforestation quickly and safely, still it would take some time before they were able to remove carbon at their full potential. So CDR only will help achieve net zero emission if used in addition to and not in place of deep emission curbs in all sectors and regions. So to discuss how the Working Group 3 report addresses CDR and its governance, the report is clear that it is important to discuss this within the broader mitigation strategies and net zero goal and their timings. How to raise mitigation ambition in this decade is crucial by using all possible and known options. Large-scale deployment of CDR will face major sustainability and feasibility challenges. However, we should not forget that lower energy demand enables 40 to 70% emission reductions by 2050 with lower reliance on CDR methods. Although we know that some CDR will be unavoidable to counterbalance the hard to abate residual emissions. Thank you very much.